A student once told me when I was teaching that, she said, I want to go back to when I was 16. I was telling, look, everybody has done a terrible, embarrassing thing when they were 16 at some party or other. And she said, yes, I'd like to go back to that party with the knowledge that I now have and not do that thing. And I said, if you went back to that party, you'd have the same knowledge that you had back then. You're going to do exactly the same thing. So there is no way of saying, oh, I'd like another life in which I wouldn't be a philosopher, but I would be a ship owner. No, it makes no sense. If you had another life, it would be exactly the same life that you already had. That's what he's saying. In other words, there's no second chance, there's no paradise, there's no eternal life. The best you can hope for is to have the same life that you had. And if that's the best you can hope for, well, you'd better try to make sure that's a good one.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to another installment of Robinson's podcast. And this episode is with Alexander Nehamas, who is the Edmund N. Carpenter II Class of 1943 professor in the Humanities, both of philosophy and comparative literature at Princeton University. Alexander is best known for his work on ancient philosophy, literary theory, the philosophy of art, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And in this episode, we primarily focus on the latter, as we could have probably gone on about Nietzsche for days on end. But we get into Nietzsche's writings on eternal recurrence, the will to power, morality, animals, the worship of greatness, his thoughts on mediocrity, and other topics, as well as Alexander's own thoughts on the perils of doing history as a philosopher, the infamous Elgin Marbles of Greece, great works of literature, personal style, and how to live one's life. Alexander's most well-known work on Nietzsche is Nietzsche, Life as Literature, which is great, and a link to which you will find in the description. Otherwise, reviews, comments, likes, subscribes, these things are always very much appreciated, especially on Apple in this troubling time where I had a 5-star average, but I think somebody left a sub 5-star review, and I have since been flung back into the 4.9 star realm, which is very troubling for me, as mentioned. Then there's also a Patreon, a link to which is in the description if you would like access to an ad-free RSS feed to ask AMA questions and show notes. And I think that's all I have to say. So without any further ado, I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Alexander. You have done a lot of work on Nietzsche, Foucault, and Plato, and time permitting, I'd like to talk at least a little bit about all of them, but I would love to start with Nietzsche, one, just because he's such an enduring, important figure, and two, because he has only come up on the show once. I interviewed Brian Leiter, but we mainly talked about the genealogy of morals, but of course, his corpus comprises so much more work than that. But for the purposes of this conversation, I don't want to assume that our listeners have an encyclopedic knowledge of Nietzsche. I certainly
Who does?
don't. Yeah. So let me just ask to begin with how you came to Nietzsche and what you think of as, quite broadly, his biggest contributions to philosophy.
Well, on the personal level, how I came to Nietzsche was that when I was 16 or whatever, every Greek intellectually oriented child read Nietzsche. We didn't understand a word of it at the time, because to understand Nietzsche, you need to know a lot about the history of philosophy, and we didn't. But we read Zarathustra, and we thought we were very wise. So then I came to America, where it was all analytical philosophy. And I forgot about Nietzsche altogether. I mean, he wasn't part of my intellectual life. But when I came to Princeton, Walter Kaufman was here, and I happened to be his TA for a class. And I got fascinated again. So I started reading him. And then when I applied for my position at Pitt, they had a large course on Nietzsche and existentialism. And they said, would you be able to teach that? Well, I don't know if I was able, but I was willing. And I did. And so I developed this interest in Nietzsche because I taught him over the years. And when I got tenure, I started writing about him, but not before. Which tells you something about the atmosphere at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So his most important contributions, it's very difficult to say. First of all, because he's so controversial, right? So one thing that I would say was a great contribution, somebody else would say that it was a disaster for the West or for contemporary times. I'm rereading Alan Bloom's book on the closing of the American mind. It's now, I think, 25 years or more since it was, and somebody wants to do something. And, I can see some of the points he makes. There are different ways of looking at Nietzsche. One way, which is not the best, but it makes sense, is to some extent to think of it as a philosopher of adolescence, which is why so many young people get attracted to him. Let me be who I am. I don't want to be what you want me to be. I want to make my own way. Many adolescents say that, and for good reason. Not everybody succeeds. Nietzsche managed to get this, if you want, adolescent revolt into a philosophical approach. So he is, one of the things that characterizes him is he is absolutely unwilling to take anything for granted. It doesn't matter that everybody believes it. It doesn't matter that there is all this tradition behind it. It doesn't matter that lives are predicated on a particular way of living. He doesn't care. And in that respect, he's very like Socrates, who was doing very much the same. I mean, he thought that the Athenians were using the traditional virtues and ideas that they had inherited, and that they were no good, and that for Socrates, you need to support your cultural, ethical, or whatever views on completely objective criteria. Nietzsche thinks that you do have to support them, but he doesn't think that the criteria are objective anymore. They are, you could say, intersubjective. Sometimes he seems to think it doesn't matter what anybody thinks. I'm the one who I am. But it's not quite like that. He's quite aware that unless you connect in some way to the culture, unless you are part of the culture, you can't criticize it. So he's a great enemy in that respect of what used to be called in the 80s and 90s totalization. He doesn't think you can take a position completely outside a context and look at it. Every context can be looked at from another context, and that's part of what is called perspectivism in his views, which for me is an absolutely wonderful view, not very easy to explain or to convince people of, very often confused with relativism. But perspectivism is not, and that's absolutely crucial. Perspectivism is not relativism, and Nietzsche is not a relativist. He even clearly says it's stupid to think that morality is relative because you see different cultures deal with morality differently. He doesn't believe in that kind of relativity at all. What he does believe, and in that respect, he was very influential on Bernard Williams, who is a major, in my view, philosopher of the later 20th century. There are points where rationality can't communicate anymore because there's so many differences between you and me that every time we have a disagreement and we say, well, let's go to the principle that could resolve the disagreement, we disagree about the principle as well. And if we try to get further up, now rationalism, or if you want to call, or Nietzsche calls it dogmatism, believes that there is a final sort of set of views that we are all necessarily committed to. And if only have enough time and enough goodwill, you'll get to them. Nietzsche doesn't think so. Nietzsche thinks that there comes a point where communication becomes impossible. And Bernard Williams has a very interesting little thing in I think it's in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy. It says, what will the professor do when the secret police break the door, smash his spectacles, and take him away. They think they're doing the right thing. I think the professor think I'm doing the right thing. But there's so many disagreements of what is right and what isn't that you can't communicate anymore. So perspectivism says that in order for me to say my view is right and your view is wrong, you don't need to appeal to a universal criterion that will be accepted by everybody. The trouble is that at some point you may reach a point where you can't no longer communicate.
Right.
But the same is true of the absolutist view. There too we come to that point and then we say, well, the reason is that you don't have enough goodwill or you're not clever enough to reach it. No. It's just there are different ways of looking at the world. And Nietzsche is very aware of that. He doesn't think that because you can't communicate, you can't think they're wrong. But you can't prove that they're wrong. There's no unprincipled way. So that's one major issue, the denial that there is an absolute foundation of human knowledge which is common to absolutely everybody, or the denial that there is an absolute higher principle that we all are committed to one way or the other.
And you label this perspectivism?
I call this perspective. He called it perspectivism himself. He took the word from a colleague of his at the University of Basel, whose chair he wanted to take and become the chair of philosophy, but they never gave it to him, which is one of the reasons he left Basel and gave up on an academic career altogether. But there are other things there that are extremely important. I think the thought of the eternal recurrence, which is one of the major issues that people have had real trouble understanding. Usually it was interpreted, partly because of the way he wrote, as the view that the world repeats its history an infinite number of times in exactly the same way. The Stoics in ancient philosophy thought something like that. But it's an absurd view. It doesn't work. There are no arguments that can show it, especially since every previous cycle is completely unknown to us, because everything that happens in the cycle supposedly happened before and will happen again. So I can't tell you, oh yeah, there was another cycle and I remember it, because if I remember it, I differentiate it from the previous cycle where I didn't remember it. So they have to be absolutely the same. And that's a silly view in a way.
Are there still philosophers who attribute this view to him?
Some do. Not very much, but some do.
It seems very uncharitable if there are no good arguments to support it.
Well, there's some efforts at an argument in his unpublished writings, but I have no idea what they're supposed to. But you see, the reason that people felt justified in attributing to him is that for many years he was considered like a madman or a poet. And poets, can say, all poets lie, he says in Zarathustra. And of course, Zarathustra then says, too, I'm a poet too. And I lie. So it was easier. It was easier to attribute such a view to him. I think the view is something much more reasonable, not completely uncontroversial. But what he's saying is, look, you can't separate pieces of yourself that are essential from pieces of yourself that are not essential. So suppose that I was, as a student once told me when I was teaching that, she said, I want to go back to when I was 16. I was telling, look, everybody has done a terrible, embarrassing thing when they were 16 at some party or other. And she said, yes, I'd like to go back to that party with the knowledge that I now have and not do that thing. And I said, if you went back to that party, you'd have the same knowledge that you had back then. You're going to do exactly the same thing.
Right.
So there is no way of saying, oh, I'd like another life in which I wouldn't be a philosopher, but I would be a ship owner. No, it makes no sense. If you had another life, it would be exactly the same life that you already had. That's what he's saying. In other words, there's no second chance, there's no paradise, there's no eternal life. The best you can hope for is to have the same life that you had. And if that's the best you can hope for, well, you'd better try to make sure that's a good one.
What's interesting about this in the context of our relationship is just we recently had lunch with our mutual friend, your much closer friend, Joyce Carol Oates, and we were talking about Robert Sapolsky's book on free will, and free will, as he sees it, it kind of depends on this idea that we could go back and act differently. So it's interesting that it's coming up here again.
No, for Nietzsche, it isn't like that. He's not against freedom. But his view of freedom is very different from the current view of, that says that you're free only if you had been able to do something else at the time. He doesn't think he's a determinist in that sense. He doesn't think you would. Every decision that I made at the time that I made either for good reasons or for bad reasons that I thought were good. If I were to go back, I would make the same decision. So what freedom is for Nietzsche is something very different. It's a view of freedom that comes down from the Stoics in ancient philosophy and Plotinus. Spinoza has something like that. And the idea is freedom is the ability to be self-directed, to be autonomous, so that the causes of your behavior are not from the outside. They're from you. And how do you do that? Well, you do that, he says, it doesn't tell us exactly how to do it, but he gives us examples of when it happens. And his paradigm, interestingly enough, is art. When he says an artist does everything of necessity, that's when the moment of the greatest freedom comes. What does he mean by that? Suppose I'm a young painter and I want to develop a style. Well, I copy a bit of Velázquez and I copy a bit of Manet and I copy a bit of Rembrandt, and I try to learn how to put those things together. And suppose that I'm lucky enough and talented and this and that and the other, and I develop my own style. Before I develop my style, I say, look, how did Rembrandt do that? And I articulate how he did it. When I develop my own style, I don't ask that question anymore. It comes naturally. It becomes who I am rather than who I'm trying to be. Mm-hmm. And for him, freedom, as he puts it, is when necessity and freedom become one in you. It's like Dennett used to apply to appeal that. It's like Luther saying, here I am, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. That's not compulsion. What that shows is that the particular action that you're contemplating is something that your whole being is willing to perform, that you're not divided. And Plotinus actually wrote that it's we who are not free because we say, should I do that or should I do the other? The one or God or whatever never has a choice of what to do because everything it does expresses all its essence. Mm-hmm. But since nothing compels it, it's free. And it's an ideal that is very difficult, of course, to accomplish. But he says there are moments when we can feel that this is happening. And I confess, sometimes when I'm in the mood and the flow of writing, I'm not saying what should I say next. It's exactly coming out of its own. And so it needs a lot of rehearsal, it needs a lot of practice. And he says in a marvelous passage that he has, says, one thing is needful, he says, to give style to one's character. And then he says how difficult it is and how you have to practice it all day. And finally he says, when the job is done, you see that there is a style. Whether the style is good or bad is less important than the fact that it was a style. In other words, you distinguish yourself from others. And that's a third very important philosophical point that he makes. His view is that a good human life is a life that contributes something new to the possibilities of human life. Any life like that is going to break rules and laws that are already accepted, exactly the same as in art. When Manet comes to make his paintings, he breaks the traditional rules of representation. He flattens up a canvas and does all that. It's considered horrible until it isn't. In human behavior, many new conceptions of how life should be lived can be seen as immoral and despicable when we begin, but eventually they broaden, even if they're not accepted directly, they broaden the range of possible human lives that we can make. So art is extremely important to him as a model for the ideal life. Now, the next problem, art is inherently elitist, in the sense that what matters is the best works, however it is that we define them. I'm not going to go into the canon issues. Everybody thinks that some works are better than others, right? But every work that's better than others has broken rules, has insulted people, both practitioners of painting and the public, right? And every new mode of life is going to be controversial, at least for a while. And what Nietzsche says is that it's a good thing that the new type of life will break some rules, because the rules, especially moral rules, which we've discussed that all right with Brian Leiter, but we can talk about it a bit more if you want. Moral rules are governed by the most fundamental moral principle. You are not obliged, you don't have a duty to do anything if it's something that's impossible to do, right? So if that's the principle of morality, morality is addressed, writes Nietzsche, to the people with the least abilities. Because if morality requires only what everyone can do, the everyone is the lowest common denominator. And for him, morality is designed to keep people mediocre and down, and discourages sort of flashes of difference, or flashes of genius. And that's very much part of his danger, because he says many people who do great things are immoral by our standards. But that doesn't matter, because he thinks that the contribution to the multiplication of human types is more important than hurting moral sensibilities. That's a very difficult, very complex, and very controversial issue. I'm not sure what I think about it, but I certainly don't think that it's enough to write him off, as many people do, especially because, and I come to the last, or one of the last philosophical ideas that I want to mention, the notion of the will to power, for which he is so famous, notorious. Most people have interpreted, is that a problem?
No, your cat is lovely, and cats are a friend to the podcast.
Okay.
So I'm just hoping that he or she comes my way at some point.
They will, yeah.
Oh, there's multiple.
There are two of them.
Oh, lovely.
This is the little one. We had lost it for 2.5 weeks. And she came
Right,
back. You
told me that at lunch,
she came back.
and she came back.
Yeah, a few days ago.
Oh, lovely. Oh, so sweet.
She's very friendly. So the will to power, most people have interpreted it partly because of Nietzsche's sister involved with the Nazis and the Nazis' use of him, that the will to power is the will to oppress other people so that you can accomplish your goals. Totally wrong. And that is serious, because it is not just a bad misinterpretation, it places him in a light that's completely different from the light that I'd like to see him in. And my inspiration, if I can be pompous enough to call it that, I was seeing Leonard Bernstein's old... Go on. She's a little shy. She'll come eventually.
Oh no, she is wonderful. Yeah.
So remind me. The Will to Power.
Bernstein,
Yeah, I was saying Bernstein rehearsed with the New York Philharmonic, a Brahms piece, and what he wants to do is for them to play it as he hears it, but they're not quite. So he makes them repeat it. He corrects some instrumentalist. He cajoles them, he jokes, he is angry. And at the end, they play it as he wants to hear it. So in a sense, he has imposed his will on them. He has exercised his will to power. In the process, he's made them better musicians. So the will to power is not putting others down. It's using their abilities so you can accomplish something great. It's a completely different attitude or interpretation. A friend of mine, a student of mine, has a wonderful metaphor for how Nietzsche can account for harmonious cultures. He says, think of building a cathedral. Of course, everybody says Brunelleschi's cathedral in Florence. It's the dome, it's Brunelleschi. But he says, no, it wasn't just Brunelleschi. It was everyone. It was from the people who were breaking the stones over in the quarry to the people who carried it, to the masons. Everybody had a job that gave their life meaning. They were doing something that made a difference. So it's not just Brunelleschi who's exploiting the masons for his purpose. It's Brunelleschi giving them an opportunity to do something great that they couldn't have done before.
It does seem, though, that there is a danger, maybe this is a misuse of Nietzsche's philosophy, but a danger that somebody will take this idea and use it as a tool to justify something terrible. Like obviously this is not chronological, but the pharaohs using slaves to make the pyramid, something like that.
Oh, sure. Nietzsche is not at all clear, misty-eyed about the awfulness of human beings. He says the beginnings of everything are drenched in blood. Everything began, every good thing was once a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about this, and while your cat is in your lap, I think it is a good time for me to ask this one question, even though there are plenty of things that are on the table now to discuss. I mentioned when we had lunch, and I mentioned this on a prior podcast episode, an interview with a psychiatrist at Stanford named Anna Lemke, that I was speaking to a Nietzsche scholar, and I told him that I was interested in a vegan or a vegetarian diet. And when I told him this, he kind of looked away and shook his head. And he said that what I should do, and I would be much happier if I did this, was relish the dominance we have over other animals. And
yes, I know. Yeah, yes. You mentioned that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that if I could, at the very least, become utterly indifferent to the suffering of animals, since this is happening everywhere, I would be a much happier person.
Of course. You would be happier. But so what? You could be happier in the Matrix, too.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything. Happiness has to have a kind of value component. And, I could be happy by getting an injection. Would I? Would I go into the experience machine of Bob Nozick? Probably wouldn't, because that's not genuine. There's something important about genuineness in this context. It's difficult to define. But first of all, I don't think we have dominance over the other animals. We are stronger. But in many ways, as Nietzsche keeps saying, every animal is perfect in its own way. There are animals that are not as clever as we are. They don't have language, and we can mostly kill them all. But the fact that we are stronger is not enough of a reason to say, therefore, we can exploit them. That's the bad interpretation of the will to power. It's the interpretation that Nazis often use.
Something interesting here, though, and maybe this is a more metaphilosophical issue, but maybe it relates to perspectivism as well, that the person who told me this is also a Nietzsche scholar, and apparently there is no fact of the matter on Nietzsche's view about who is correct, if I was understanding what you were saying earlier, or whether...
No.
Okay.
No. That's part of the confusion between perspectivism and relativism. There's no more judgmental philosopher than Nietzsche.
Okay.
He's constantly saying that, the other people are wrong. The issue is not whether you have a universal standard that will decide. The issue is, do you have the better reasons than the other person? The trouble is that if the other person doesn't recognize your reasons, then you have to go, as we were saying before, up to the principle that some principles that you both hold and decide which reasons are right. And sometimes it happens. Sometimes it doesn't, and you go further up. And what Nietzsche and the perspectivists are saying is there is no final principle that will adjudicate all. But you don't need a final objective principle in order to decide particular cases. Some cases will be undecided. But as I was saying before, that's also true whether you believe that there is a universal standard or not. They're still going to be undecided. You're just going to say, we just can't get there. Well, So in general, I think that Nietzsche is he has his weak points, but he is a much more positive thinker than he's given credit for, both by philosophers and by comparative literature, people who read him a lot, and by the public in general. He's still seen as an anti-Semite by many people. It's a complete fabrication. Now, he had certain anti-Semitic feelings, like everybody did at the time. Nobody was beyond it. But when his sister married the head of the anti-Semitic movement in France, in Germany, he was livid, absolutely livid. And one of the things that he wrote to her is, do you realize what that's going to be to me? To have you married to this Nazi? Anti-Semite. And the project in South America, they went and built a city in South America, Nueva Germania, they called it. It fell apart. She came back. She was very much a Nazi, and spent a lot of time trying to get Hitler to come to Weimar, to the Nietzsche archive. And there's a picture of Nietzsche looking at Nietzsche's bust, actually very suspiciously. He's looking at him. And she's the one who wrote his biography, in which she projected a much more conservative, authoritarian view than he actually holds, and sort of identified him with the Nazi movement. But he would have hated that. He hated Bismarck. He hated the German Reich. He thought it was completely culturally decadent and sort of despicable, in fact. So no, he would not at all be pleased with what happened to him.
And I don't want to suggest that this is in any way vital to Nietzsche's philosophy, but it is of vital interest to me in this moment. And I am curious what his relationship to animals was.
We don't know very much. He certainly thought that humans are an animal, a more complicated animal than others, but an animal nonetheless. He thought there weren't imperfect animals, that every animal reaches the best that its genetic makeup can accomplish. And, apocryphal or not, the last story of his conscious life has to do with being in Turin, seeing a coachman flog a horse, and putting his arms around the horse to protect it. And then both horse and Nietzsche collapsed. And he never stood up again. That was the end of his rational life.
Just how apocryphal do you think this
Not
is?
that apocryphal, actually. I think it's been mentioned by a number of people. And I don't see there's any reason not to believe it, unless somebody comes and says it couldn't have happened, he wasn't there.
That is not only a poetic way to go.
It's incredible. Yeah.
But it's an incredible way to go given the bad reputation he has.
Exactly.
Right?
No, he says at one point that the elect, which he does believe in the elect, he says he's against the notions of duty and obligation. He thinks that those are moral concepts that that wants nothing to do with. But says, yes, we people, we do have a duty. We have a duty to be kind to the others. So it's much more subtle and complicated than it is. It happens to him all the time. You may have heard that famous line that is attributed to him, are you going to women? Do not forget your whip in Zarathustra. And people say, what are we talking about? Well, people have tried to defend him by saying, well, it's Zarathustra who says it's not Nietzsche. Or it's an old woman who says it to Zarathustra, it's not Nietzsche. It's embarrassing all the same, until you actually read him carefully enough. And there's a later passage, a climactic passage, where Zarathustra comes face to face with life, who's a woman. And he starts chasing her and insulting her. And he finally catches her and says to her, have I forgotten my whip? Not I. And then she says, Zarathustra, don't use the whip. Whip makes noise, and noise destroys thought. And so they sit down together and they become friends. It's only when he gives up the whip that he can be a friend with a woman. It's not while he holds the whip. So here's something that is in fact the exact contrary of what people have attributed to him, because we tend to read him little piece by little piece by little piece. So there's very little effort to put his works together. They're not easy. The genealogy is one of the easier ones, and that's why we teach it as much as we do. But you try to teach Zarathustra or Daybreak, and it's very difficult because you read those little sections. By the time you finish reading the next one, you've forgotten what the previous one is about. So it's very important to try to find a narrative structure, if there is one in his books. And then you see that he, things that he says, he doesn't take back, but he shows you how differently they can be interpreted. And for him, interpretation, of course, is the fundamental human activity. Anyway, everything has to be interpreted. That's what he says. Morality. He says morality. He says is an interpretation of life. More specifically, a misinterpretation. And in genealogy, he tries to show how that works. When he talks about how, remember, this bad conscience becomes guilt. In the second essay, how it's misinterpreted into guilt. He constantly talks about that. And he does have a thing about morality. There's no question about it. There's never been, among great philosophers, such an enemy of the moral as Nietzsche. But he himself was not immoral. In fact, he was famous or known for being an extremely polite, punctilious, shy person, completely different from the character that appears in the works, who's grandiloquent and, full of himself and, I'm a dynamo, I'm a prophet, I'm this, that, and the other. In real life, he was, a little, almost blind man who got sick a lot. Mm-hmm. But, and that's the other thing that has to do with the eternal recurrence, in Ecce Homo, his autobiography, strange book, title has to do with Jesus, Ecce Homo. But the chapters have these great titles. Why I am so clever, why I write such books, why I am a destiny. But inside it's all, and then I was born that way. I happen to be there. It's all of things happening to him rather than he's doing them. Usually biographies start with my life, right? A very sort of down-earth title. And then I'm so great, I did this and the other. For him, it's exactly the other way around. But what he says there is something, to me, absolutely fascinating. He says that he only had one good day out of 3 or something like that because he was so sick. He had those horrible migraines with vomit and, terrible, terrible. But he said, that made me learn how to write quickly. It made me write. In other words, the reason that he writes that way is that he didn't have a week or 2 weeks or a month of uninterrupted thought to write treatises. So he wrote aphorisms, which are fantastic. Without the disease, he wouldn't have written aphorisms. Well, he might have written great treatises, but the eternal recurrence says we don't know.
Yeah.
Because if one of those things goes, the rest collapses as well, because you don't have a second chance, so to speak. So the only thing you can do is make use of what is given to you and what you can make what was given to you and accomplish whatever it is that you can accomplish. The trouble is that he believes strongly that only a few people can accomplish things. That's the elitism. And where I disagree with him quite seriously is that he thinks that there is a class of great people and then they're slaves or sheep or whatever he calls them.
You disagree with him on this one?
I think as an art, there are gradations. There are Rembrandt and Manet and Bach, and there is, I don't know, Renoir and something worse, and finally there's Elvis on velvet. All those are art, from the very bad all the way to the very good. And I think people are like that too. There are people who really, for one reason or another, don't accomplish anything in their life. And there are people who accomplish immense things, and there are people who are in between. It's the same. For me, there's Proust, there's Cavafy, there's Thomas Mann, there's Jane Austen, there is, Jonathan Franzen, and there are one-night stands with whodunits. It's all a continuum for me.
This is very much a tangent, but since you mentioned Proust, I'm just curious how you think about this. I'm also very interested in literature, but I approach literature that I have to read in translation with some hesitation because I'm not sure I'm getting what this truly great
Absolutely.
individual has created. It's being filtered and reinterpreted to some extent by somebody else. I am wondering, you hold Proust in such high regard. Did you read him in the original French and in the English or the Greek, or how does
I've
you
read
form this
him
opinion?
at least in part in all three languages. I think the French and English I read all. The Greek, it's more recent and I'm working on it, yeah. And it's interesting because you get different things from different translations, which confirms what you just said, that there's interpretation. But I think the English translation is finally revised twice, or three times basically, is quite accurate in many ways. There's a nice, there's a new 6-volume translation, the first volume of which is by Lydia Davis, which is quite good. The others I don't think are nearly as good. So the old Moncrief, Pryor, not Pryor, what was his name? Minor, something like that. Then Kilmartin and Enright, I think, get some things very right. They get the texture of those immense sentences in a good way. So don't stop because of that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in...
Whenever you have another 2 years free,
Yes. I enjoy rankings, and I know this is taking us a little bit away from Nietzsche, but who else do you put up there in the top of the literary figures?
Literary figures? Oh, Homer.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly.
Yeah. It's difficult to say. I'm talking more about the people that I have spent a lot of my life with, and they are Proust, Cavafy, the Greek poet, an amazing poet.
I don't know the name.
Oh,
I don't think.
You're so lucky.
What
because you can now get
period?
to know him. Cavafy was born in 1863 and died in 1933.
Okay.
And he was pretty unknown in his time. He was a great friend of E.M. Forster, actually, and wrote relatively few poems, which he published in a very strange way. He would print them in broadsheets and then pin them together and give them to his friends. And then when a new poem comes, he would get the thing back and add the poem. I think most of the poets at Princeton whom I've talked to and other people I know say that he's one of the 5 unavoidable poets of the 20th century. He's, anyway,
I'm disturbed that I don't know the name. Very disturbed. I wonder if I'd see it, if I'd understand it written down. But no, I think you're right.
Cavafy, Cavafy.
No, it doesn't.
In fact, when Jackie Kennedy died, her companion read one of his most famous poems called Ithaca at her wedding, at her funeral. And Princeton had to republish like 5,000 or 10,000 copies of the other collected poems. It's a great poem because what it says is that go ahead to the trip on Ithaca. But Ithaca doesn't matter. What matters is the journey. Ithaca is going to disappoint you no matter what, he says.
Well, it is absolutely lovely to discover a phenomenal artist that you hadn't known existed.
He
so
is.
I will have to read his work.
Be careful, the translations are a problem.
Right.
there,
That's one reason that I don't know as much poetry in translation, because while I've encountered some wonderful translations, since I haven't exhausted the English poets.
enough there to go. But anyway, so Thomas Mann would be way up there for me. Jane Austen would be soon below them. I think these are my real, in literature. I read a lot, but these are the people that I keep coming back to. Let me put it that
I'm
way.
just curious about two people who aren't on that list, and that's Joyce and Hemingway, and how you think about them, and then we'll return to Nietzsche.
Hemingway I haven't read for a long time. We read a lot of him in high school, and I read a lot of him in college. I think he's very good. I wouldn't put him with those people. Joyce is an amazing character, as you've seen already. Her oeuvre is incredible. When not just the number of books, but when you see the poems, the collections, the reviews, the blogs, the letters, it is, I don't know what kind of brain it is that can produce so much written prose. I think she should be a candidate for the Nobel Prize, but
I'm in complete agreement with you about that, but I just want to make it clear, I would never have asked you about Joyce Carol Oates in this interview, knowing that we're friends and she's going to see this. I was asking about James Joyce.
James Joyce, well, no, I mean, he's great. It's just, and I've always, admired him a lot. He's one of the people I spend as much time with as I do with these others. For one thing, I'm not a native speaker. He's difficult.
Yeah.
Especially Finnegan's Wake, which I can't deal with.
Your English, though, is better than 99.99% of American
I admire
English speakers.
Philip Kitcher, who can actually write a book about it. It's...
Is Philip Kitcher, he's a native English speaker?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know many non-English speakers who've written about Finnegan's Wake, actually. Yeah. I had a teacher, John Wallace, who's a philosopher, he's now in Minnesota, who used to love the book. Every time he would go to another trip, he'd buy a new copy of it. But no, Joyce, Beckett, even Sartre, I think, is, and then there's Flaubert, whom I adore, there's Stendhal, Flaubert is... for me, a very great writer. But then, I also like painting and I like music. There's just not enough time in life, unfortunately. There are more good things in life that you can deal with. Mm-hmm. There are also more bad things in life that you can deal with. But we Nietzscheans think that, of course they will.
Perhaps a natural segue would be to your conception of Nietzsche as seeing the world as a literary work. And this is what I would immediately like to get back to. But I have another sort of metaphilosophical question about doing the history of philosophy and then something about animals. And the question I have is, I think that there's a serious danger of doing, when one is doing history of philosophy, of using the historical figure as a sort of avatar for your own views. Say you have a position that you want to defend, you go out, you find some philosopher, some famous philosopher who has some writings that could be interpreted as favoring your view, and then you really try to bolster this defense so that you have Nietzsche on your side or Hume on your side or something like that. I'm wondering if you agree, if this figures into your scholarship. And the reason that I think that it's important to ask this is I'm wondering how you think Nietzsche would feel about factory farming, eating animals, these sorts of things. And since he didn't write about it, you really have to, as a Nietzsche scholar, guess what he might have thought, and you run a danger of putting your words into his mouth.
Well, of course, sometimes you don't have enough material to be able to make a reasonable guess. But the main issue that you're raising, I think, is really, really important. I mean, There are different ways of looking at it. One cynical way of looking at it is that people who do that, myself included, are cowards. They don't want to take responsibility for their views, and they say, well, Nietzsche says it, you'd better accept it because you're not as good as Nietzsche. Some of that, I think, can be, unfortunately, explained that way. Another way is to see it is that you believe that what people are doing today is really the right way to do things. So you're trying to find in earlier philosophers either anticipations or agreements, and you think that that's paying them a compliment in a way, that they were so ahead of their time as to anticipate me. It's like what Sartre calls progress in the words in his autobiography. He says, when he was a child at least, he thought of progress as that dark straight line that led to him. And there is a sense, we all have a sense that we are living on the apex of history, not realizing that 50 years from now they are going to be saying, how the hell could they do what they did? I was once, there's this artist who does works that do not involve the creation of any objects. He thinks there are too many objects in the world. So he creates those happenings that have no props. He doesn't want them to be reviewed. He doesn't have to have posters advertising. And one of them was in the Guggenheim Museum, and it was called This is Progress. And he had people like me wait for people as they were coming in the Guggenheim and taking them on a walk, talking about progress in very different ways. And what I realized when I was doing that is that there's nothing that we can do that doesn't have a price. No step forward in progress that doesn't hurt something. Sometimes something that we don't care about, often something that we do care about. So cars made life much easier, but the highway system destroyed I don't know how much arable land, and it brought dirty gases into the air and all that. Would I exchange it? Would I go back to? No. Mm-hmm. But we pay a price. And that's very much the Nietzschean view. That there is, whenever you accomplish something new, you're destroying something old or something contemporary. And the other way around, interestingly, in the genealogy, he says, he imagines somebody saying, you're just negative, you're just destroying things here. And says, if a temple is to be erected, a temple must first be destroyed, which is uncannily accurate. I was once, many years ago, in Greece, and we're in the Peloponnese, and we went to see a very early proto-Christian church, which has been built exactly where a late pagan temple was built. It not only used the architectural structure of it, it used some of the material of it. So they would take the marble slabs that have Dionysus chasing whatever nymphs and turn them around so that you wouldn't see them. But in that way, they preserve them. So you destroy it, but if you destroy something, you also are, to some extent, limited by the form and the content of what it has. So although Nietzsche is always seen as a revolutionary, he realizes that you can't get completely outside your culture and change it from the outside. You have to be within. And that's another, I think, extremely important feature of his views, and one that anticipates more modern views. With somebody like Nietzsche in particular, there has been a movement or a way of approaching him that says, we will vindicate Nietzsche if you make him sound like us today. Right? If he anticipates cognitive science, if he anticipates determinism and freedom of the will issues, if he anticipates that, if he anticipates the other. Actually, Brian Leiter is, I think, one of the mainstay of that approach. And on that respect, I mean, though our views both of views have changed over the years, I think Nietzsche is interesting and important because he doesn't agree with us. He thinks we're doing something wrong. I agree that some of his views can anticipate ours, but he puts them to a very different use from what we do today. So I think there's something what Richard Rorty and historians would call a very Whiggish interpretation of the history of philosophy that suggests that we are the top of the line, and anyone who can show any kind of awareness of us is thereby vindicated. I think maybe with some people you can do it. With Nietzsche, you can do it a little bit. But another bit about Nietzsche is to use what has been called the hermeneutics of suspicion, of saying things that seem to be given parts of nature and saying, no, they were created at some particular point. And you need to find out when they were created, how they created, and what contribution they're actually making. Because if you can show that something that we think of as a natural progression, if you can show that it's historical, if you can show that it had a beginning, then it will have an end. The question is not, well, if it has an end, let's end it, is should we end it? And a lot of Nietzsche's interpreters from the Comte and French side in the 80s and the 90s thought that whenever he showed that something didn't have the foundations that it's supposed to have, it should be thrown out. That's not his. So in a way, I'm a gentle Nietzschean, as somebody that was a view that Crane Brinton put out in the 40s, I think, or the 30s, the gentle Nietzscheans. I am a kind of gentle Nietzschean. I don't want to emphasize his worse sides, and I think his politics can be pretty bad, as a matter of fact. I don't think we can get a political theory out of what he says. I think he was rather unsophisticated about that. But he can be interpreted, and he gives us sometimes reasons to interpret him in a less than positive way. There's no question about it. A friend of mine, another colleague, has said that his writing about the Jews in the genealogy was reckless, which is a good way to put it. It's reckless, even though he is defending them. Because what he's saying to the Germans is, you are Judaized already. You're Judaized already. Don't think that the Jews are a foreign body. Mm-hmm. Christianity is a Jewish invention, and it's part and parcel of what you've become. Nevertheless, he gives you handles to say he is being anti-Semitic, without, I think, one of his last, crazy letters was, he wrote Burkhard, I think. No, he wrote his other friend in Basel. He said, I'm having all anti-Semites shot. It's one of the last things he ever wrote. He's a very complex man. For a man who collapsed at 44, I mean, it's incredible. It's Mozart in music, or Schubert or something like that. It's really incredible, yeah.
I'd like to focus in on some of the things you said about progress and history of philosophy, where we always kind of think of ourselves as at the pinnacle of some domain of inquiry. And there's a cultural anthropologist by the name of Roy Sieber who said something along the lines, I think this might be what he said, that the history of taste is a story of constantly shifting attitudes, which are neither cumulative nor infallible beyond the moment in which they are in favor.
It depends how long the moment is.
Right. But so we always feel like we're at the top and it's not going to be usurped, but then it inevitably is. And I believe that this quotation came in the context of some of his writings about African art, and how it was really viewed at one point as just being this product of primitive savagery, right, and so distant from what the contemporary painters were doing, this sort of thing. And I'm wondering, just as a philosopher of art, and given what you said about your authors at this highest list, where you have Homer, who's thousands of years ago, and somebody that's much more contemporary like Proust, how you compare and weigh them given this view of progress?
I don't. I think that comparing, weighing, and judging is one of the worst things we can do in the arts, even though we do a huge amount of it. Now, it doesn't matter who is the greater artist, especially if you're talking about people with great difference in time or in different genres. Is Bach better than Shakespeare? Makes no sense to ask that question, right? And I think that aesthetics and criticism have been obsessed with judging. It's as if, and I think that it drives me crazy sometimes, it's as if we see criticism as, well, it's the traditional view of American aesthetics and criticism. You first describe the work, you then interpret it, and then you evaluate it. As if the end of my interaction with the work is to decide if it's good or bad. No. If I think the work is good, then I go on interpreting it. It's the other way around. For me, the judgment of beauty, this is beautiful, this is great, this is good, is always an intermediate step. It's never the conclusion. The conclusion is to understand. The conclusion is to find out exactly what this work of art is about. So value judgments are pricks. They are stimuli to go on. If I tell you that something is very good, I'm not describing it. I'm telling you, go look at it. You like it. I may be wrong, but that's what you do. And part of the trouble, I think, here is that most philosophers who do aesthetics, when they think about criticism, they think about reviewing. And in a review, that's what you want to hear. You want to hear whether it's good or bad so that you can go and make up your own mind about it, right? But criticism seldom ends up by saying, oh yeah, it's a great work. It assumes, since it's already interpreting it, that it's an important piece of work, and then continues interpreting it. So I think I'd like to shift the sequence in which aesthetic judgments are made. The value judgments are intermediate. They are stimuli to go on further. And the purpose is to see what exactly this extremely complex object in front of me exactly is, you see. Mm-hmm. So again, I don't agree with the other distinction that aestheticians are making between what something is and what something means. I have trouble with my philosophy of language friends too about that. Because I think that can I give you an example?
Please.
There's a great film, I don't know if you've seen it, it's called All That Jazz. It's by Bob Fosse, the great choreographer, and it's autobiographical, it's about him. And at one point, Roy Scheider, who plays Fosse, has just opened a new movie and he's very depressed. And he's talking to his daughter the next morning, who's 13 or something like that. And she says, oh, it's the first R-rated movie I've ever seen, and I loved it. And says, you loved it, but did you understand it? And she says, oh, yeah, I understand everything except for that scene where those two girls are in bed together. What's that all about? And he gets very embarrassed and says, well, darling, there's some women, and just interrupts and says, lesbian scenes are a turn-off. And says, you're right, I should have cut it. Now, what's happening here? He assumes that his daughter thinks that the scene is two women kissing, and what it means is two lovers in bed, right? But she takes two lovers in bed as what the scene is and wants to know what the meaning of it is. Mm-hmm. In other words, what counts as what a scene is and what it means is not an absolute distinction.
It's perspectival.
It's perspectival. And what is the meaning at one stage of interpretation becomes the given at the other stage of interpretation. And on and on and on. And for me, the procedure has no end. Because if the purpose is to understand the work completely, complete understanding of anything is impossible. What does it mean? What is it to understand this cup completely? Unless you have a background interest, I want to know how it serves coffee, or I want to know why it has this particular slogan on it or whatever, it would mean accounting for and explaining every property that it has. But the notion of every property of an object is, I think, not a well-defined notion. So there is no such thing as complete. There's only understanding from a certain perspective, if you want to do that. And for me, the process of knowledge is always an ending that way. So I don't know how we started with that, but here we are now.
Yeah. Well, one other topic came up that it had never occurred to me that you and I were going to discuss this, but you mentioned that a temple must be destroyed for another temple to be erected. And what this brought to mind, and it's very topical given your heritage and your mug, which says I'm not yelling, I'm Greek, is the Elgin Marbles.
And the Parthenon marbles.
The Parthenon marbles. I did not, when I was in high school, I just found this book. I had read God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and lo and behold, right next to that was his book on the Parthenon marbles, which he refers to as the Elgin Marbles.
That's what they used to call, yeah.
But I think that this is not an obviously Nietzsche-related question, but it is an interesting question in the philosophy of art and restitution, appropriation, who owns it. So maybe for our listeners who don't know what the Elgin Marbles are, since they might be sort of a niche topic, what are they and how are your feelings on how things are unfolding today?
Well, in the early 1800s, when Greece was, or what is now Greece, was under the Ottoman Empire, Lord Elgin, who I think was the ambassador of Great Britain to the Sultan, supposedly got a permission from the Sultan to take some of the frieze of the Acropolis of the Parthenon and take it away. We have never found the order. We have a translation of it. So there are some legal issues about whether Elgin had the right to take them or not. Let's leave that aside. He took them. He brought them to England, and he then went bankrupt. That's why he gave them to the British Museum, who proceeded to clean them completely from the color they had. So they're now this completely white thing. All Greek statuary was very garishly painted, as a matter of fact. So it's nothing like the pure Greek white stuff that we see now. And then it went to the British Museum, and nobody thought about it very much. A Greek minister of culture back in the 70s opened the issue, the actress Melina Mercouri, who was a very famous character at the time, and we've been talking about it since then. Look, I'm not big on revisionism in general. I am not sure that you should be taking down all the statues of characters in history, whether American or Russian or whatever, that you have now repudiated. Maybe you should not keep them in the place they were. Maybe you should put them somewhere else. But the idea of erasing your history, I find Stalinist. That's what he did all the time. It's like whiting people out of photographs. That's not the way to do it. Do I think the Parthenon marble should return to Athens? In general, I don't think that everything that was taken away has to be returned. I think there are very complex reasons about, first of all, the time was different. People should have the chance to see them, etc., etc. But the Parthenon marbles are an integral work of art. We only have a few left in Greece. And we've made this great museum that has a complete replica of the frieze with copies of the ones that are missing. It's an important monument because what it shows is the procession of the Panathenaic festival, which was the major festival every 4 years in Athens. And it, in a way, it's a description of what a citizen of a small democracy would do. It has something to teach us, so to speak, something that we can learn from it. And that's why I think it should go back. Not because it belongs to us. That, I think, is a bad argument because it's a legal issue, and I don't know how it's going to be, if that's What I think should happen is, instead of blaming the British for stealing them, we should thank them for keeping them in good shape, because the Acropolis had been falling apart. It had more damage occur to it from the beginning of this century of the 1900s till today than it had all the way up to then, because of the air.
Wow.
Yeah, the marble was becoming chalk.
Wow.
You see. Now, it had been bombed before, and it wasn't, in terrific shape, but it was in much, much better shape in the 1830s or whenever Elgin came. But from the 1900s and up, when industrial production started going up and the air was like that, it was a disaster. So they mostly have to bring most everything in because they won't have it. So the fact that in the British Museum, taken care of, preserve them in much better shape. So we could thank the English for doing that and ask them to have us even as a permanent loan. I don't care how it is. But I think it's important for people to see the whole thing and to be told the story of what is being depicted, which is how Athenian citizenry ran its town, its city. So that's an important lesson. So that's the reason. Now, whether everything that was more or less looted from every country where the West colonized, whether it should return or not, that's a much, much bigger question. And I don't know the answer to that. I think it has to be decided on case-by-case basis. So that's my view on the Parthenon marbles.
I really appreciate that view. And I like how the argument is quite simple and avoids, as you just mentioned, these much bigger issues of colonialism, and it stands on its own right.
It has to, because if you put it in the context of colonialism, then you open the door to everything, and you won't be able to get
adjudicate.
Certainly not on a general basis. I mean, what would it mean to say everything that was taken from every country in the world will have to go back? Where are they going to put it? Do they want it? Are they going to be able to protect it? Many, many questions here. So you have to,
And it's not that those aren't very important questions, but they're certainly not easily answered from practical purpose if you want those marbles back.
Very difficult. But, it's another thing about, we were talking earlier about African art. In a way, the Europeans took from African art the best things that they could find, at least by their taste. And what did we give them instead? Little icons of the Virgin Mary, commercial art. We gave them the worst things that we had. Mm-hmm. Horrible. We exploit their art, and instead of giving them the opportunity maybe to do something with our great art, we treat them like, third-rate citizens. Colonialism, I lived in a country that was quasi-colonial, not completely, but quasi-colonial. And it's a bad thing. Until very late in the 19th century, the major Greek parties were basically known as the English party, the French party, and the Russian party. The foreign powers, the European powers, were very, very involved. And, not always a good thing. Sometimes it was. But anyway, so the thing that, to go back to to what we were saying before, is that I'm not sort of a great supporter of trying to read the ancient philosophers or the past philosophers as anticipating. In the 50s and 60s, ancient philosophy became a major topic within analytic philosophy, which it hadn't been. Up to then, Plato, Aristotle, and the rest were mostly dealt with in classics department. But what happens was that two people, Gregory Vlastos in America and Gwilym Owen in England, actually made a revolution and argued convincingly that these people were, in some sense, our contemporaries. The way they did it, especially Vlastos, is to say they're asking the same questions as we are, but their answers are not as great as ours. And that was the right thing at the time. That's what got people to get interested. And that's when all of a sudden, in the late 60s and early 70s, every major department wanted to have a classical philosophy. I think, correct as that was at the time, correct because it worked, I think it's the wrong approach. They're not asking our questions and giving bad answers. They're asking ancestors of our questions, to which they're giving brilliant answers. So Vlastos, for example, to get technical for just a minute, Vlastos thinks that when he wrote that when Plato sees the sentence, Socrates is tall, he understands this sentence as saying Socrates is a member, epsilon, of the class of tall things. But he has this silly idea that for the class of tall things, for the word tall to be meaningful, it has to refer to the class of tall things. And then you have the theory of forms and... Right. I think it's pretty clear that Plato does not understand what it means to say Socrates is tall. The thing that we find most easy and is for him and for the Greeks in general a huge problem. Here's Plato in the Phaedo. If anything is beautiful other than the beautiful itself, it's beautiful because it participates in that beautiful. In other words, only the form of beauty is beautiful. Now that seems paradoxical.
It does.
Especially if you talk about largeness or tallness, right? And Vlastos said that Plato had a huge problem with that. I want to say no. Plato looks the sentence, beauty is beautiful, and understands it in a very different way. He understands beauty, however we define it, is what it is to be beautiful, which makes perfect sense. The trouble is that if that's what it means, how can I say that Socrates and Alcibiades are both beautiful? Because if is beautiful is understood as is what it is to be beautiful, you have Alcibiades is what it is to be beautiful. Socrates is what it is to be beautiful, but Alcibiades is not Socrates.
Right.
So what it is beautiful is not what it is beautiful, right? So only one thing can have the right predicate.
Right.
But they don't know about predicates yet. They have to invent the notion of a property, of a predicate, of the copula, all that. And it takes about, I'd say, 120 years.
Oh, only that long.
Well, that's not very little. But Parmenides is the one who starts it. And then Plato and Aristotle eventually figure out how two things can be the same without being the same. In other words, they can be the same, they can have the same property, which doesn't mean they're identical. But that, which for us is absolutely elementary, was something that took over a century to decide. And one of the reasons for studying those people is not so much to find out what their views were, is to find out you can learn about philosophy from the way they dealt with those very, if you want to say, primitive issues in what I think is an absolutely brilliant way. That's a different way of looking at the history of philosophy. You don't try to find, you try to find what the view is, but it's not the view itself that's important. It's the dialectical method that the philosophers used in order to get there. That's what's inspiring for me. Yeah.
Right. Oh, no, I agree with you entirely. I'm interested in some contemporary questions about the boundaries of physical objects. And
physical boundaries?
Yes.
Very Aristotelian.
Yeah, exactly. Lots. And it's not that I think Aristotle has the right answer for contemporary physics, but he's thinking in such a way that I think is very useful for contemporary physicists.
Even if it's wrong, it's useful to see where exactly the mistake is. But you see that he doesn't have the means that we have to deal with that issue, but he's doing something really important about it. And because he did that back then, we can do what we're doing today, even if it's something by denial, by negation. So I think that, the history of philosophy, I think, is essential to philosophy. I know not everybody agrees. And you can do good philosophy without history. But the methods, I think, are not really different. When I deal with Plato, look, almost every positive view that Plato holds in metaphysics or epistemology is wrong. You know, that's not what I'm going to be dealing with, right? What I'm going to be dealing with is the way in which he dealt with those issues. That's where the importance of the history of philosophy is. And you can learn much about how to do philosophy well by looking at those people. Furthermore, if I deal with Plato, it doesn't, and what, am I going to give another argument that, the forms don't, there are no such things as forms? No, we know that they don't exist, right? What matters to me with Plato and with the great philosophers is how they put all those views together into a system. In which case, it doesn't matter to me so much whether the particular view is true or not. What matters to me is the picture of the world and of life that these people create. When I write a paper in the Journal of Philosophy about the most recent paper on quantum physics, it's only about that I'm talking about, not the general context in which it comes. No, the other one could. But generally speaking, you just need to address a specific argument, in which case you will, of course, say it's true or it's not true. But the way you read it in order to decide whether it's true or not true is very much the same in which I read Plato's arguments and the way I put them together. So the difference, I think, between so-called systematic philosophy and so-called historical philosophy is not that systematic philosophy cares for truth, whereas history philosophy doesn't care for truth. History philosophy cares for the truth, or at least for the attractiveness or for the viability of pictures, philosophical pictures, rather than specific philosophical issues. By and large, I mean, it can, and sometimes a contemporary philosopher can talk about Quine's picture of the world, or Bernard Williams or Richard Rorty, whatever it is. We don't not do it. But it's much easier to focus on a particular issue. And if you do focus on a particular issue, it's much easier to decide true, false, good argument, bad argument. With the ancients and even people, from the 19th century for that matter, it's something slightly different, I think. But the method of interpreting, of trying to figure out what they're saying, no difference, I think. None whatsoever.
The reason that we got into this historical question, or a question of doing historical philosophy, is I used that to preface this question about how you think Nietzsche might respond to animal agriculture today.
It's very difficult for me to say. We just don't have enough discussion of animals in Nietzsche in general. He ate beefsteak every morning for a while. That he thought that was a good diet. So he certainly was not a vegetarian. My view is probably that he would not be against meat eating. I think he would not approve of the methods that we have. I think that, industrial farming, I think, it would not be something like, mostly because he was a very kind person. But I think his view is that it's pretty natural for us to be eating meat, and so we should. Now, he also thinks that we can overcome nature. That's the one thing about human beings. So if somebody could show him, a la Peter Singer or whatever, that it's not a good thing to eat animals, he would. But he probably wouldn't do it on moral grounds, because he doesn't accept moral grounds. He would do it on questions of humaneness or questions of kindness or something like that, which I think he was very full of.
It's interesting to me that you contrast humaneness with morality. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about why the humane does not fall under the category of the moral.
The morality, as I see it, addresses our relationships to other people, and mostly, with some exceptions, wants to base our relationships on other people on more or less objective rules. Humaneness is not like that. Humaneness proceeds not from a rule, but from a feeling, an instinct, a frame of mind, so that it could even, not sometimes it conflicts with morality, but sometimes they could go together. But it's different. It's a kind of a sense that you need to take the specific person, situation, animal, or whatever it is, into essential account of your reaction. Whereas a number of ethical theories or moral theories depend on the view that equal treatment is absolutely essential. And that's a problem with friendship, which is another topic that I'm very interested in. It's very interesting that philia in Greek, amikitia in Latin, they were very important for a while in philosophy. But with modernity, all of a sudden people stop talking about friendship, philosophers. Kant says just a few things about it. It disappears. And I think the reason it disappears is because of the Enlightenment's great accomplishment of, human respect and equality. And we started thinking that these are extremely important values and mostly forgot about values that are non-moral or political and put them out of the question. I'm trying to write something right now that I've always found it funny that two of the most different philosophers of the past so many years, Richard Rorty on the one hand and Martha Nussbaum on the other, who care about literature and both try to convince philosophers that they should read literature and take lessons from it, both try to do it because of the moral significance of literature, which seems to me completely the wrong way to go about it. Because we have tended to identify all value with moral and political value. And we've forgotten about non-moral values like friendship, like elegance, like beauty, like all kinds of other things that have been pushed aside. And Harry Frankfurt some years ago wrote in a preface to his book that he's disturbed by the pan-moralism, as he calls it, and quite correctly. So one of the things that I'm trying to do, and there are other people who are trying to do, and Nietzsche's influence is crucial in that, is to open a space for values that are extremely important in life, but can't be accommodated under morality. And the rubric, I think, is it's a Socratic rubric, that ethics is the genus, and ethics deals with how life should be lived. Morality is one element in how life should be lived, but neither the only one nor the overriding one. And again, I think at times we'll have real conflicts, and it's not always clear to me that the moral aspect will win. I've been reading Dworkin's book on Justice for Hedgehogs, where he thinks that a life without morality can't have been lived well, even if it was a good life in the sense that you satisfied all your desires and you're famous and all that. And I'm not quite sure about that, especially because he too makes a connection with art and saying that we could live our lives as works of art. But if art is the model of life, then you get to that elitist view that I was saying before, which is not what somebody like Dworkin, who's a liberal and an egalitarian, would want. So I think there are issues there that I'm trying to figure out.
Speaking of living our lives as works of art, one of your famous interpretations of Nietzsche involves him looking at the world as a literary work and life as a literary work. And toward maybe spending the last part of our conversation about how one ought to live one's life and how Nietzsche's philosophy connects to that, just what is this thesis that you have, and how roughly do you defend it in connection with his works?
Yeah, it's not the world itself that's a text for Nietzsche. it's that we are always interpreting the world. And interpreting the world, we always construct narratives. By the same token, he thinks we live our life in that way too. And the model that he has for how a life is constructed and how it's interpreted is an artistic model. And I use as my model Proust, because what I think is remarkable about Proust is that you're reading a book which tells you how this person has wasted his whole life. But then at the very end, he says, no, maybe I haven't. Maybe I will be able to write this book. And then you realize it's the book you've already read, which is another version of the eternal recurrence, right? So what he thinks is that as an art, what counts, the works that count, are all importantly different from other works, which doesn't go the other way. It doesn't mean that if something is different, it's going to be a good work. The important has a big role to play here. The same way human lives are great or commendable or admirable if they accomplish something that no one else has accomplished. Right? That's the way in which he thinks of life as a work of art. Now, that could mean that the only values that matter in life are aesthetic values. In other words, the only matter that if it's imaginative and elegant and this and then the other, that in other words, that you should live as an aesthete. That's not quite right. What he wants to say is that these non-moral values are also extremely important in life, and that a good life needs to include them. Now, as a matter of fact, he thinks that moral values specifically are bad values. They'll stop you from exploiting those values. But I am more moderate than that. I say, no, moral values have a place in life. But to take what among philosophers is a sort of a cliche example, would I have preferred Gauguin not to leave his family and go to Tahiti? No. Even if he had failed, I might not have, because I would have admired his dedication. But especially since he didn't fail. The only person who actually said he shouldn't have gone is Alan Wood.
Really?
Who is, of course, the editor of Kant's works. But the only person. Everybody else agrees that, that's the other one, agrees that sometimes moral values are trumped by others. Most philosophers will not agree with me on this, I think. But I see, Nietzsche again says a very interesting thing. Great men may have had their virtues too, but they certainly had their vices, which we reinterpreted as virtues once they won. So
workaholism being a major one.
For example, or as he says at one point, he says, when you're trying to establish a new state and you're revolting against the old one, cheating and lying and killing are all things that you want to do. But once you establish yourself, those things which are destabilizing for the state become sins. Which is, one man's terrorist is another one's freedom fighter. This is really what he's saying. And it's true. It's right. We keep doing that. So I am not quite as extreme as he is in saying, forget about moral views altogether. Forget about the view that you should treat others as equal. There are different ways of interpreting that. For example, his view that people are not equal has very little to do on whether they should vote or not, for example. But he does believe that we come into two groups. And that, I think, is deeply wrong. His view of human beings, by and large, is he sees us as the, 3 million or whatever it is, herd of wildebeests. So when the wildebeests travel every year, they travel 3,000 miles around Africa following the grass and the rains. And the predators are waiting for them. So whom do the predators eat? They eat the sick, the weak, the young, who are at the edges of the herd, which suggests that you should be in the front. In fact, the strongest, fastest wildebeests are in the front. But what happens when they get to a ravine or a river? They hesitate. And a million wildebeests come behind them and stomp and tramp on them and kill them. Mm-hmm. So where should you be? In the middle. Mm-hmm. Average. That's what saves you. Mm-hmm. And he thinks, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological and a intellectual, whatever sense, that's what human beings are like. That most people are average and want to be average. And the people who excel are also in danger. As he says, it's the tallest tree that the lightning hits in the forest.
What is the danger for these people at the front, since we're not wildebeests?
Well, one thing would be the danger of the established order, excluding them, killing them, not paying attention to them, or whatever, thinking that they're crazy, marginalizing, or sometimes being shot, even. So if the moment that you differentiate yourself from a crowd, you create both admiration and hatred and jealousy. So it's a dangerous thing to stand out.
Is there a good reason then to stand out for Nietzsche?
Those who are like that can't help it, you see.
So it's not so much a reason, it goes back to sort of necessitation and eternal recurrence in a way.
You can't choose to be great. You can choose to try to be great. It's the same way. You can choose to write a novel, but you can't choose to write a good novel. You'll write it if you can.
Yeah.
You see. I mean, everybody tries to write a good novel. Mm-hmm. But that's not a matter of intention. It's not a matter of control. It's a matter, but you do have to get yourself in a place where your ability will be able to be exercised. So there is a lot of work to be done. But it's not, I'm going to write the great American novel. No. What you write is, this, that, and the other. Maybe it'll be the great American novel. Probably not. Mm-hmm. You see. So there is that. For him, he is a determinist, so there's very little that we choose in a kind of free sort of alternative possibilities that could have done elsewhere. He doesn't think we could have done otherwise. But we could become free and run and sort of govern our life if we manage to internalize the various things that we have learned from the outside. I learned to drive late. So I remember when I started driving, I would say to myself, now you have to look at your speedometer. Now you have to look at your mirror. Now you have to make that your wheel is... and I would decide, I will do this, I will do that, which sounds free. But that wasn't freedom. Freedom was when I internalized all those things and I no longer had to think about this, then the other. It's that kind of automaticism that for Nietzsche suggests that one is free, because I no longer had to listen to an outside advice about what to do. I knew what to do it, you see. And that, I think, is absolutely crucial to him. Now, I don't know that every artist works that way. But clearly, if you have a style, if you've developed a style, you're not deciding at every step, am I going to put my brush this way or that way? Your body is doing it right. It's now muscle memory.
Right.
And for him, that's what it is. Very different view from what we generally have about freedom, but I think extremely attractive. And, for all I know, compatible with this determinism. But I'm not going to, as I told you, determinism is too hard. I can't deal with that. The other thing about Nietzsche that I think it has to be said is that he thinks that philosophy should affect your life. It's not, as it were, an academic discipline only. And I believe that. I mean, I have no idea how successful or failed I am. Actually, Lanier and Josh have written an article about that, saying that I have managed to succeed within an academic framework.
Lanier Anderson and Joshua Landy at Stanford,
Yeah.
for our listeners.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's possible to do it. And most of the philosophers I admire, Socrates, Montaigne, Pascal to some extent, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Foucault, they were not academic. Or if they were academic, they left. I stayed. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to pronounce a judgment of that, but somebody will at some point if they're interested. Because it's not clear. You have other obligations when you're in an institution. Mm-hmm. And the question is, can you negotiate your relationship so that you actually connect your life with what you think? Am I able to respect in the end somebody with whom I share, as far as I can tell, no common. My barber, he was here this morning because he has come for Susan. He's a Trumpist. We try to talk, and we can't. Everything I say has another interpretation. For him, everything he says has another interpretation for me. Should I respect that? Or should I say he's an idiot? Part of me says, you can't just say he's an idiot. Another part of me says, I can. The fact that I can't convince him is his fault, not mine. Which is, of course, exactly what he says about me. Mm-hmm. And I think, even though I still think I'm right and he's wrong, there's a little nail inside that says, well, it's a great, on the one hand, it's a great advantage. On the other hand, it's a great disadvantage to always try to see things from the other point of view. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes it neutralizes you. It sort of makes you unwilling to act. Because, they're seeing it that way, and who am I to say that I'm the right one? This is where perspectivism and relativism start to get together a bit. But you need to fend against it, I think. On the other hand, I find it very strange to think of philosophy as a profession, as something that you do until 5 o'clock, and then you go home and you have your drinks and you see your husband and your wife and kids, and then you start again. It's something that I think should not permeate, but have an effect on the things that you like, on the things that you don't like, on how you spend your time. My thought says you learn a lot about life from working with art. And I spend a lot of my time with art. Some people have described my work as elegant, which is a put-down. Whenever people say, oh, that was an elegant paper, I know that they're saying it's bullshit, but I don't know if you can use that here. So there's a sense in which you don't want to just apply aesthetic values to life, but you want to and replace others, but you want to include them. It makes a difference to a life if it's lived in a kind of consistent, pleasing way. If it doesn't involve abrupt changes that don't lead to anything. When it sort of falls apart and it's just one episode after another, there needs to be some kind of narrative unity. Now, when you make the narrative up is another question. You can't make it at the end because you're dead, and you can't make it in the middle because it can change. But that's why Nietzsche says, have you ever had one moment when you wanted it again? And if you did, then you wanted everything back, because everything is connected. It's not something that I can go around all day long saying, oh, yeah, I'd live my life over again. That's not something that we say. I mean, when people ask us, we can say that. But all he wants to say is that if ever you said, stay with me, moment, I want to have you again, then you're saying, I want my whole life again. And what you want, of course, is very interesting and peculiar. My teacher, Gregory Vlastos, when he read my first paper on the eternal recurrence about everything happening again, he said, look, I couldn't care less about which tie I wore someday. And a day I could live again with a different tie, nothing would happen. And I said, yeah, the point is that A, if you had to put that tie on that morning, you'd put that tie only. And secondly, you don't care about ties. So when you think about your life repeating yourself, what tie you wore is not going to be part of the picture that you have. It won't matter. For a dandy, what tie they wore is very, very important. And for that person, the recurrence will involve everything that died. It's very interesting how what matters makes a difference to the kind of life that you envisage. And the things that don't matter, they will come anyway, but they won't matter.
Does philosophy weigh in on your sense of or interest in fashion?
Yeah, it does.
I would really like to hear about that.
Well, there's a whole book about fashion, which I haven't have it in there, but I haven't read it yet, unfortunately.
Philosophy and fashion?
Yes, okay. I'll show it to you after.
Please.
Fashion, or following fashion to some extent, is a commitment to living in the present within a group of people who also care about fashion, many of whom are not intellectual, are rather shallow by our standards. They're not people who would like to be like, at least given what we think philosophers should be. And don't forget that philosophers, ever since the ancient times, had a reputation for being dressed badly. All the satires that are philosophy are dirty and, dirty beards and everything. I think that, again, to engage in fashion and to even think about how it is that fashion changes, which I think is a why does it change? Is it only commercial interests that make it change, or is it some other broadly cultural, more broader cultural factors? I think that's interesting. What's the difference between fashion and progress? Is philosophy more like physics, or is it more like fashion? Mm-hmm. Is there fashion philosophy? And of course there is fashion philosophy, and we need to take account of that. Also, the fact that you connect with a group on one axis does not mean that you identify with them in all axes. And furthermore, and I think that may be a personal confession that does not making me particularly likable, it's a way of being different. It's a way of being different. When I first got a job in Pittsburgh, I had to go downtown to sign my lease. I went to this business building with a friend of mine from Carnegie Mellon, and we had hair out to here and jeans and, whatever. It's 1971, to whatever. And we get in the elevator, and there are 5 other people, all of them wearing a suit. I turned to my friend and I said, look, they're all wearing uniforms. And he said, so are we.
That's good.
So you can't avoid fashion.
Right.
The question is, which fashion?
Yeah.
And whether it's acceptable or not. I remember many years ago, my teacher, David Furley, talking about another colleague of ours, said, we really should get him a pair of trousers of which the pockets don't have holes so that his pens don't constantly fall out. It's okay to do that in philosophy. But that's the thing. We don't care about material things. But it's not an essential feature of philosophy that you don't care about material things. We all care about material things, one way or the other. The question is, what kind of material things? How important are they in your life? Whether they intrude on the rest of your life and the things that you consider important or not. So I think there are philosophical issues in everything. No matter what, you can find something that would be recognizable, at least by people with relatively open minds, as philosophy. Now, unfortunately, much of philosophical talk begins with that's not real philosophy. I think that's a terrible thing because real, in that case, functions as a perfectly negative, exclusionary maneuver. It's metaphysical. One about the things that I loved about being in Pittsburgh is that for 15 years, I never heard that expression. Never. Even people with completely different interests of mine, were willing to take me seriously as I did them, even though we're doing things that, had almost no intersection. There was no overlap between them. Other places, you hear it more. And generally speaking, it's not real philosophy means it's not the philosophy I respect. But that's not a metaphysical point. That's an expressive point. And sometimes you can say that's not real philosophy in the sense of saying this is so different from what we do that it's not something that I want to deal with. Sometimes I'm tempted to think about that in connection with people in comparative literature. Sometimes, not always. I think but I can be pretty intolerant too when it comes to it. I don't want to project this image of myself as this, wide open, tolerant man who, is willing to acknowledge the good in everything. No, there's bad in everything too. Sometimes more than good.
How do philosophical considerations manifest themselves, if they do, in what you wear? You personally, I'm curious. Do they manifest themselves? I mentioned earlier, last time we met, you had a monogram on your shirt, which I really liked. It's not something that you ever see anymore these days.
It also embarrasses me a bit.
Does it?
Yeah. They're very comfortable shirts, so the hell with it. And what I was thinking actually was maybe I should have them made and not put my initials on them. Because it does suggest, well, I get my shirts made, How I dress, I try to dress simply and comfortably. Basically, I was actually thinking of interviewing you, of having you interview me in my pajamas.
Really?
Because when I'm at home, I'm in pajamas. They're much more comfortable than clothes. I don't see why we're not allowed to them outside. The Indians wear them. I don't see why we shouldn't. It's so much more comfortable than wearing all these constraining
Interesting.
things.
I try to dress nicely at home too. It depends on what one. I'm wearing jeans right now, but
they're unusual jeans.
They are unusual jeans, but I just enjoy being surrounded by beautiful things, and I don't see why one can't have beautiful pajamas. I'm totally
You can.
I'm totally open to that.
It's just I find them much more comfortable. The first thing I will do when I come home is take off my clothes, put my pajamas. When workmen come and I say, look, I'm not sleeping. This is my working uniform. In fact, but there's something. You get the sense that people think that either you're not a totally real intellectual or you're not totally committed to the academic life or you're just trying to make a kind of Wildian impression. After all, he does say that if I'm occasionally overdressed, I make up for it by being always immensely overeducated. Which is a great line. But some of it is historical. My parents liked to dress well. They got me to put good clothes. And also, good clothes are by and large more comfortable. And if they were custom made, they're even more.
Do you think that there are good reasons to sacrifice comfort for personal style?
It depends. Yeah, absolutely. Many people do. I don't think it's always
high heels are a good example, probably.
Who?
High heels, just as a garment.
Yeah. I never understood how people can do that. Yeah, I mean, I still find the fact that women have to make themselves up as much as they have to, as opposed to men, except for Trump,
Yeah.
unfair. I don't think that unfair, patriarchal, whatever. But yes, I think sometimes looking good is a way of being good.
Could you say more about that?
I don't know. It just came to me.
It just came to you? Looking good is a way of being good.
In some cases, it's the right thing to do to look good. For one thing, if you go to say a party or a reception and you are on purpose badly dressed by the standards of the party, you're making other people very uncomfortable. They don't know how to deal with you.
It's also a way of showing respect at certain functions.
Exactly. It's a way of not being different. And sometimes I think that, and also, if you believe that well-made clothes are good looking, then there's a prima facie reason to wear them. Because it's better to look good than not to look good. Unless you think that looking is not at all important. Mm-hmm. And that is the view of some philosophers.
Yeah, not just philosophers. A lot of mainstream people also feel that way.
But I think that's completely wrong. And I think the distinction between looking or seeming and being is not that different from the distinction between being and meaning that we were talking about before. There's a fantastic report of an experiment done in Michigan about beauty. They focused on the rowing team of the University of Michigan. And before the season started, they asked people to rate each other for attractiveness. They had a ranking. Then they did it again at the end of the season. And it's very different.
Interesting.
The people who came atop were also the best rowers, the best teammates. And the interpretation they gave of this is that it was a physical attractiveness versus sort of human attractiveness. And say, no, it has, in other words, outer and inner looking being. No, it has to do with your first impression, where you have very little evidence to go by, and your final impression, which takes in much more. So somebody who looks good usually promises that there's more good inside. Doesn't always work. And very often we are very disappointed. But when in the proverbial philosophical situation where you enter a reception and there's this face that strikes you, you're not seeing just a shape. You're seeing a face that has expression. And its good looks are a promise that there's more good stuff in, and you want to know it. That's why when you're attracted to somebody, apart from just staring at them, what you want to do is go meet them, get to know who they are, see what makes them look that way, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I think that, I guess I'm very suspicious of qualitative distinctions of being, meaning, looking, being. I think that they're much more often a kind of continuum between knowing less and knowing more. So I don't like levels. Did we talk about the experiments about faces last time we were together?
No.
They've done a whole series of experiments on cultural agreement on beauty. So if you show people 10 faces, 10 pictures of faces, people will have extremely different rankings, Then the more pictures you superimpose upon one another, the more agreement you have. Why? Well, the current explanation mostly is beauty is averageness on a biological level, because averageness is an indication of health. And what you're looking for is men look for women who are average, because average means that you haven't had any diseases. Because if you have a disease, you don't develop in the same way, where your arm or your eye or whatever goes in a different direction. So averageness is health. Women Men look for healthy women for children.
Is it average or symmetry?
It's average.
Okay.
I'll come to that in a minute. And women look for dependable men. It turns out the best examples are when they take a picture of a face, they cut the two halves, and then they make it symmetrical. Then they add more and more symmetrical pictures, and people love it. The explanation, however, is that that's, the biological basis of beauty. And then you add intelligence, sensitivity, whatever. So you have a layer cake view of what beauty is. And I want to say, it's not like that. What those judgments of beauty are with those pictures are the most elementary judgments on the least possible evidence that we could possibly have. And when we're dealt something like that, we are going to use the broadest categories that we are privy to, and our broadest categories are biological. So of course we're going to do that, but that doesn't mean that that's real beauty or the biological basis, because if we get to know those people better, our judgments are going to diverge, because the biological part, though there, is not what they all presuppose. It's just what you have. So did you ever see Papillon, that film? It's about this guy who's at Devil's Island and who's starving. And after, I don't know how many days he's without food, he grabs a cockroach and eats it. So I want to say, he's reduced to his basic biological level. He'll eat anything that has any protein in it. Does that mean that what we really like to eat is cockroaches? And that souffle is, no. You'll eat whatever is available at that point, but if you give me a souffle, I'll take that even more. So it's again, it's not a matter of layer cakes. The same thing about works of art. It's not plot, meaning, theme, as the old view was. Jaws, The Old Man and the Sea, and Moby Dick have the same plot. Man pursues fish.
Yes.
Now everybody says, well, the whale's not a fish. That's
Yes.
okay. Melville has a whole chapter on that. But that doesn't mean that. What does that mean? The plot of Jaws is very gripping and very simple. And I stayed up a whole night, didn't sleep all night to finish the book. The Old Man and the Sea took me a little more. Moby Dick, it took me years to finally get in. If you ask me what the plot of Moby Dick is, if you knew nothing about it, I'd say it's a man pursuing a whale. If you know something about it, I'll tell you something much more complicated about Ahab and this. If you're a scholar of Moby Dick, I'm going to assume that you know a lot of it, and let's talk about what does that particular thing that Ahab does at that particular point mean. Taking all the other things for granted, everything that we take for granted is plot. And then we take and say, what does this mean? Once we know what it means, it becomes part of the plot again. So again, you have a continuum. And this notion of a continuum in many of our activities and many of the objects that we deal with is crucial to me, absolutely crucial. Maybe I'll write something about that.
Well, Alexander, I mentioned at the beginning Plato, Nietzsche, Foucault. I think that might have been the only time Foucault's name was mentioned.
Let me say, Foucault is important for me because of his relationship to Socrates. So all my people are in one way or another related to Socrates. All the people I like the philosophers who write in a thick style and who, instead of simply arguing for their views, are constructing a persona, an image of who they are, and putting it out there for you to do as you like with. They don't say, be like me, you can't. What they're saying is, that's how I did it. See if you can too. They're examples, of how a life can be lived. Now, people say Nietzsche had a terrible life, right? He was sick. He didn't have a terrible life because the books and the writing and the philosophy are an essential part of the life. When we think of the life and the work, we think of the life as everything but the work. The bills, going to the bathroom. No, that's part of it. But so is the writing, to which these people devoted most of their life. So I don't know if that's a bad life or not at all. So anyway.
This has been terrific again, so thank you so much.
Not at all.